On December 27, 2012, 4-year-old Samiah Downing was found buried in a shallow grave about 25 miles south of Baker, California. Although her body was badly decomposed, investigators would later confirm she had suffered extreme abuse, so severe it became known as one of the most shocking child murders in California's history. But this story doesn't start with tragedy. It starts on the most romantic day of the year. On February 14, 2008, a baby girl was born on Valentine's Day. Her name was Samiah Christine Cornell Downing. And to her 17-year-old mother, Monica, and 16-year-old father, Ronald Greer, she was a gift of love. They called her Little Peanut, and despite their young age, they were determined to make things work, at least in those early days. Before we continue, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps share these stories so more people can hear them. For the first few years, Samiah lived a life much like any other preschooler in America. She celebrated birthdays, played with toys, and spent time with her extended family. Her grandfather, Christopher Downing, cherished every moment with her. He never imagined that the bright little girl who called him Papa would one day be at the center of a murder case that would horrify an entire community. At the time of the murder, her father, Ronald Dean Greer Jr., was only 21 years old, barely an adult himself, when he took on the role of primary caretaker for his daughter. By then, he and Monica were no longer together, and Ronald had full responsibility for Samiah. He had his own struggles, his own demons, but nothing in his past hinted at the calculated cruelty that would later take place behind closed doors. The last time Lori Cabasiak saw her great niece alive was Christmas 2011. Samiah was 3 years old, still small enough to need help reaching the presents under the tree, still innocent enough to believe that the adults in her life would always protect her. What none of the family members gathered that holiday could have predicted was that they were witnessing their final moments with Little Peanut. By mid-2012, Samiah's life had taken a dramatic turn. Her father had entered into a relationship with 19-year-old Bianca Annie Mayest, a young woman who would soon become the co-architect of unimaginable suffering. The couple moved into an apartment in Adelanto, California, a desert community in San Bernardino County, where the summer heat can be brutal and neighbors often keep to themselves. Medical records from this period would later reveal a chilling transformation. In the middle of 2012, Samiah's weight was still in the 50th percentile for her age, perfectly normal for a healthy 4-year-old. She was active, curious, and developing just as any child should. But something sinister was already beginning to take root in that Adelanto apartment, something that would systematically destroy every aspect of this little girl's existence. The apartment itself became a prison engineered specifically for a child. Greer and Staunch installed that deadbolt on Samiah's bedroom door, ensuring that once she was locked inside, there would be no escape. They positioned the locking mechanism on the hallway side, making it clear that this wasn't about keeping dangers out. It was about keeping Samiah trapped within. But the modifications to the living space were just the beginning. What investigators would later uncover was a systematic pattern of torture that included daily beatings with belts and cords, prolonged water deprivation used as routine punishment, and nights spent with her tiny wrists and ankles bound with duct tape. The 4-year-old, who had once giggled at family gatherings, was now being forced to stand in corners for 8 hours at a time, her small body trembling with exhaustion and thirst. Detective Jay Steers, who would eventually lead the investigation into Samiah's death, had worked hundreds of cases involving child abuse. But even he wasn't prepared for the evidence that would emerge from that Adelanto apartment. Evidence that suggested the torture had become so routine, so methodical, that it had simply become the daily reality for a little girl who should have been learning her ABCs and playing with dolls. The question that would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and family members for years to come was as simple as it was devastating. How does a father, someone who should love and protect his child above all else, become capable of such systematic cruelty? And how does his girlfriend, barely out of her teens herself, become an active participant in the torture of an innocent 4-year-old? But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Samiah's story wasn't just what happened behind closed doors. It was how many people witnessed pieces of the abuse and failed to intervene. Over 20 witnesses would eventually testify during the trial, painting a picture of a community that saw warning signs but didn't connect the dots until it was far too late. On December 27, 2012, nearly 2 weeks after Samiah had already died, someone finally made the call that would expose the truth. A tipster contacted the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, reporting that they hadn't seen the 4-year-old in quite some time. It was this single phone call that would ultimately unravel a web of lies, torture, and murder that had been carefully hidden for months. But by then, little Peanut was already lying in a shallow grave in the desert. Her small body, the only remaining evidence of one of the most horrific child abuse cases in California history. The investigation that followed would reveal not just the mechanics of how a child dies from systematic torture, but the chilling psychology of the adults who could look into the eyes of a 4-year-old and choose cruelty over compassion day after day after day. The first red flag came during a routine traffic stop. When officers pulled over Greer's vehicle, they found him traveling with another child, but not Samiah. When asked about his daughter's whereabouts, Greer's story was suspiciously rehearsed. He claimed Samiah was staying with her mother, painting a picture of a normal custody arrangement. But when deputies contacted the mother, she insisted Samiah was supposed to be with her father. The interviews that followed revealed the cold calculation behind Samiah's disappearance. Under mounting pressure from investigators, both Greer and Staunch eventually led police to a desolate stretch of desert south of Baker, California, a remote area where the Mojave Desert stretches endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with Joshua trees, and marked by a silence that seems to swallow sound itself. It was there, in a shallow grave, hastily dug into the hard desert earth, that investigators found what remained of little Peanut. The 4-year-old, who had once brought laughter to family Christmas gatherings, was now nothing more than small bones and clothing fragments, her body so decomposed that only an autopsy would reveal the full extent of what had been done to her. But even before the medical examiner began his work, the crime scene itself told a story of desperation and callous disposal. This wasn't a carefully planned burial with any semblance of respect or remorse. This was body disposal, pure and simple, carried out by individuals who viewed a 4-year-old child as nothing more than evidence to be hidden. The arrest of Ronald Greer and Bianca Stanch on December 27th marked the beginning of an investigation that would expose systematic torture, so methodical, so deliberately cruel that prosecutors would later argue it represented one of the worst cases of child abuse in California history. But it was the arrest of the third suspect, Ryan Stanch, Bianca's 26-year-old cousin, that revealed the cold calculation behind Samiah's death. Rand hadn't participated in the torture. He hadn't lived in the apartment where Samiah suffered. But when his cousin needed help disposing of a 4-year-old's body, he didn't hesitate to assist. His arrest on December 28th at 9:15 p.m. painted a picture of a support network that enabled the unthinkable. Relatives and friends who knew something terrible had happened but chose to help cover it up rather than seek justice for a murdered child. The autopsy results, when they finally came back, confirmed what investigators already suspected. Samiah had died from dehydration. But this wasn't accidental dehydration from a child getting lost in the desert or forgetting to drink water during play. This was systematic, deliberate water deprivation used as a form of torture against a 4-year-old who couldn't understand why the adults who were supposed to care for her were slowly killing her instead. The medical examiner would later testify that Samiah's weight had dropped from the 50th percentile to the 5th percentile in the months leading up to her death. But the dehydration was just one element of a torture regimen, so comprehensive that it defied comprehension. Evidence from the apartment revealed that Samiah had been subjected to daily beatings with belts and cords, her small body bearing the evidence of countless impacts designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death. The 4-year-old had been forced to stand in corners for 8 hours at a time, her legs trembling with exhaustion as she struggled to remain upright under threat of additional punishment. Perhaps most disturbing were the nights when Samiah's wrists and ankles were bound with duct tape, ensuring she couldn't move freely even in sleep. The child who should have been dreaming about cartoon characters and birthday parties was instead spending her nights in restraints, unable to shift position or seek comfort when pain became unbearable. The water deprivation was so severe that Samiah, in her desperation to survive, had once consumed cleaning solution when seeking any form of liquid. This detail revealed during the trial painted a picture of a 4-year-old so desperate for water that she was willing to drink chemicals rather than continue suffering from thirst. It was a moment that crystallized the absolute helplessness of her situation. A child literally dying of thirst in an apartment where clean water flowed freely from the taps. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was how methodical the torture had become. This wasn't abuse that occurred during moments of rage or frustration. The installation of the deadbolt, the routine water deprivation, the scheduled beatings, all of it pointed to torture that had become as routine as breakfast or bedtime stories should have been the life of a 4-year-old. Greer and Staunch had turned the basic needs of childhood, food, water, safety, comfort, into weapons of control and cruelty. They had taken a little girl who should have been learning to read and transformed her existence into a daily struggle for survival that she would ultimately lose. The question that emerged from these early revelations wasn't just who had killed Samiah Downing. That was becoming increasingly clear. The question was how two people barely adults themselves had become capable of such systematic cruelty toward a helpless child. What kind of psychology allows someone to look into the eyes of a 4-year-old begging for water and choose to withhold it as punishment? And perhaps more disturbing, how many people in that Adelanto community had witnessed pieces of this torture and failed to intervene? How many adults had seen warning signs, heard concerning sounds, or noticed Samiah's deteriorating condition, but chose to look the other way rather than get involved? As Detective J. Steers expanded his investigation beyond the desert grave, he began uncovering a disturbing pattern of willful blindness that had enabled Samiah's torture to continue unchecked. Over 20 witnesses would eventually come forward, each carrying pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, revealed a community that had collectively failed to protect a 4-year-old child whose suffering was happening in plain sight. The first breakthrough came when investigators began interviewing neighbors who had lived adjacent to Greer and Staun's apartment. What they discovered was that Samiah's torture hadn't been conducted in complete secrecy. It had been an open secret that multiple adults had chosen to ignore. Neighbors reported hearing prolonged crying sessions that would last for hours, the sound of impact against walls, and adult voices screaming at a small child with a level of rage that made them uncomfortable. But discomfort, as it turned out, wasn't enough to motivate action. One neighbor would later testify that they had seen Samiah standing motionless in the corner of the apartment through an open window, her small body trembling with exhaustion as she was forced to maintain the position for what appeared to be hours. The witness described feeling sorry for the little girl, but admitted they never considered calling Child Protective Services or the police. Another neighbor recalled seeing Greer carry Samiah into the apartment while she appeared to be unconscious or semi-conscious, her small body limp in his arms. Even this alarming sight wasn't enough to prompt intervention. The witness later explained they assumed the child was simply sleeping and didn't want to get involved in family business. The investigation revealed that the torture had escalated dramatically in the months before Samiah's death. Witnesses described seeing the 4-year-old appearing increasingly thin and lethargic during brief public appearances. Her once bright personality had been replaced by a hollow, frightened demeanor that should have been a red flag to any adult who encountered her. But perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of individuals who had actually entered the apartment and witnessed abuse firsthand. One visitor described seeing Samiah duct taped to prevent movement, while another recalled observing the child being denied food and water as punishment for minor infractions. These weren't brief glimpses through windows. These were extended observations of systematic torture by adults who were close enough to intervene but chose not to. The case took nearly 8 years to reach trial, delayed repeatedly by defense motions and ultimately the CO-19 pandemic. When proceedings finally began in early 2020, prosecutor Justin Crocker faced the challenge of presenting evidence so disturbing that several jurors would require breaks during testimony to compose themselves. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented medical evidence showing Samiah's dramatic weight loss, crime scene photographs documenting the torture devices found in the apartment, and witness testimony that painted a picture of abuse so systematic it defied comprehension. But the centerpiece of their case was the autopsy report that confirmed what investigators had suspected. Samiah had died slowly and painfully from deliberate dehydration. The medical examiner testified that the child's body showed evidence of prolonged malnutrition and dehydration, with internal organs beginning to shut down in the days before her death. They also described finding evidence of multiple healed fractures, suggesting that the physical abuse had been ongoing for months or possibly years. But it was the testimony about the boiling water incident that left the courtroom in stunned silence.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Witnesses described how Greer and Staunch had poured scalding water on Samiah's back and chest as punishment, leaving burns that would heal into permanent scars. The 4-year-old's screams during this torture session had been so intense that neighbors reported hearing them through multiple walls. The defense strategy, when it finally emerged, was as predictable as it was unconvincing. Greer's attorneys argued that their client had been unaware of the extent of abuse occurring in his own apartment, suggesting that Staunch had been the primary perpetrator while Greer was absent for work or other activities. When Greer finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of this case. Under direct examination, he painted himself as a loving father who had been manipulated by his girlfriend into believing that strict discipline was necessary for his daughter's behavioral problems. He claimed ignorance about the water deprivation, the duct tape restraints, and the systematic beatings that had occurred under his own roof. But cross-examination by Prosecutor Crocker exposed the lies and contradictions in Greer's story with surgical precision. When pressed about specific incidents of abuse that neighbors had witnessed him participating in, Greer's responses became increasingly evasive and contradictory. He claimed he had been working during times when witnesses placed him at the apartment during torture sessions. Most damaging was Greer's inability to explain how he could have been unaware of his daughter's dramatic physical deterioration. Prosecution evidence showed that Samiah's weight loss would have been immediately apparent to any parent who spent time with their child. Her sunken cheeks, protruding ribs, and obvious dehydration weren't subtle changes that could be missed. They were the visible signs of a child dying slowly from systematic neglect and abuse. The prosecution also revealed that Greer had been present during the boiling water incident, contradicting his claims of ignorance about the most severe forms of torture inflicted on his daughter. Witness testimony placed him not just in the apartment, but actively participating in restraining Samiah while Staunch poured the scalding water on her small body. As the trial progressed, it became clear that both defendants had constructed elaborate justifications for their actions. They claimed Samiah was difficult and defiant, requiring extreme measures of discipline. They suggested she was prone to lying and manipulation, painting a 4-year-old child as somehow deserving of systematic torture. But Prosecutor Crocker systematically dismantled these justifications, pointing out that even the most challenging child behavior could never justify withholding water until the point of death. He reminded jurors that they were dealing with a 4-year-old whose cognitive development made her incapable of the complex manipulations her torturers described. The question hanging over the courtroom wasn't whether Greer and Staunch were guilty. The evidence made that clear beyond any reasonable doubt. The question was whether a jury could comprehend the psychology that allows two people to systematically torture a helpless child while convincing themselves they were justified in their actions. As the 6-week trial neared its conclusion, family members who had packed the courtroom gallery prepared themselves for a verdict that would determine whether justice could ever truly be served for Little Peanut. On October 6, 2020, after 6 weeks of testimony that left seasoned court reporters struggling to maintain their composure, 12 jurors filed back into a San Bernardino County courtroom carrying a verdict that would finally deliver justice for a 4-year-old girl who had been failed by every adult in her life. When the 4 women stood to read guilty on all counts against both Ronald Greer and Bianca Stench, the sound that erupted from the gallery wasn't celebration. It was the collective exhale of family members who had waited nearly 8 years to hear those words. But even as family members felt a measure of relief, the sentencing phase would force them to confront the inadequacy of any punishment when weighed against the loss of a child whose life had barely begun. During victim impact statements, Samiah's grandfather, Christopher Downing, struggled to find words adequate to describe the hole left by his granddaughter's absence. "She would have been 13 this year," he told the court, his voice breaking as he calculated the birthdays, holidays, and milestones that would never come. "She would have been starting to worry about boys, complaining about homework, asking for a phone like all the other kids. Instead, we're sitting here trying to make sense of how the adults who were supposed to love her could choose to hurt her instead." Lori Kabasiak, Samiah's great-aunt, delivered perhaps the most powerful statement of the proceedings. She described the little girl who had brought such joy to family gatherings, whose laughter could fill a room, and whose smile could melt the hardest heart. But she also spoke directly to the community failure that had enabled Samiah's torture to continue unchecked. 20 people testified in this trial about things they saw, things they heard, things they knew were wrong, she said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. 20 people who could have made a phone call, knocked on a door, or demanded answers. "My great-niece died not just because 2 people chose to torture her, but because 20 others chose to look the other way." The sentencing on March 12, 2021 brought both closure and continued frustration for Samiah's family. The judge sentenced both Greer and Stanch to 32 years to life in prison, ensuring they would spend the majority of their remaining years behind bars. But as family members pointed out, no sentence could restore the life that had been stolen or undo the months of systematic torture that little Peanut had endured. District Attorney Jason Anderson used the sentencing as an opportunity to send a broader message about child protection in San Bernardino County. "This case represents the absolute worst of humanity," he stated outside the courthouse. "But it also represents our commitment to ensuring that every child in this county knows that their community will fight for them, protect them, and seek justice when they are harmed." Prosecutor Justin Crocker, who had spent years building the case against Greer and Stanch, emphasized that the convictions sent a clear message about the community's responsibility to protect vulnerable children. "We cannot bring Samiah back," he acknowledged, "but we can ensure that her story serves as a warning to anyone who might consider harming a child and as a call to action for anyone who witnesses abuse." The case had taken a toll on everyone involved in the investigation and prosecution. Detective J. Steers, who had led the initial investigation, admitted that Samiah's case had changed how he approached his work. "You see a lot of terrible things in this job," he reflected. "But when you're dealing with the systematic torture of a 4-year-old, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature." Rand Stanch, who had helped dispose of Samiah's body, had pleaded guilty earlier in the proceedings in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors. While his specific sentence wasn't made public, his guilty plea helped solidify the timeline of events and confirm details about how Samiah's body had been transported to that desert grave south of Baker. The nearly 9-year delay between Samiah's murder in December 2012 and the final sentencing in March 2021 highlighted the challenges of prosecuting complex child abuse cases. Defense motions, appeals, and ultimately the COVID-19 pandemic had stretched the legal proceedings far longer than anyone had anticipated, forcing family members to relive their trauma repeatedly as they waited for justice. But perhaps the most important outcome of the trial wasn't the convictions themselves. It was the conversation it sparked about community responsibility for child protection. The testimony of 20 witnesses who had observed abuse but failed to report it forced uncomfortable questions about when neighbors, friends, and acquaintances have an obligation to intervene on behalf of children who cannot protect themselves. Child protection advocates used Samiah's case to push for expanded mandatory reporting requirements and community education about recognizing signs of abuse. They pointed out that multiple intervention points had existed throughout Samiah's torture. moments when a single phone call could have saved her life. The case also highlighted the limitations of a system that relies heavily on reports from the public to identify child abuse. Despite clear signs of Samiah's deteriorating condition and multiple witnesses to her suffering, no one had contacted Child Protective Services or law enforcement until after she was already dead. As family members continue to process their grief and search for meaning in Samiah's death, they focus their energy on advocacy and prevention. They've supported legislation to strengthen child protection laws and participated in community education programs designed to help adults recognize and report suspected abuse. Samiah's story has been featured in true crime podcasts, documentary programs, and advocacy campaigns, ensuring that her name and her suffering aren't forgotten.